What you are about to hear is the story of a forbidden love between a Spartan woman and an Athenian warrior, set against the backdrop of war. The Aegean Sea stretched endlessly beneath the cliffs, its waters shimmering beneath the light of a full moon. The wind carried the salty scent of the sea, and the waves crashed rhythmically against the jagged rocks far below. It was here, on these cliffs, where the warrior Alexios from Athens and Eirene, the daughter of a noble family from the rival city-state of Sparta, first met. They had no reason to trust one another, no reason to even speak. But fate had a way of weaving impossible stories together. The cities of Athens and Sparta had been edging toward war for years, each city-state preparing its warriors, each noble family strategizing alliances. But when Alexios had been sent to survey the borders of enemy territory, he had not expected to encounter Eirene. Eirene was unlike anyone Alexios had ever seen. With her long dark hair cascading down her shoulders and her eyes reflecting the same fire that drove warriors to the battlefield, she carried herself with grace and defiance. She wasn't afraid of him, though they stood on opposite sides of a brewing war. Their meeting had been pure coincidence. Eirene had been walking the cliffs alone, finding solace in the cool night air, while Alexios had been scouting the coastline, his armor clinking softly as he moved. When their eyes met, there was no need for words. They both knew the danger of even acknowledging one another, but the pull was undeniable. "I should leave," Alexios had said, his voice low, though his body made no movement to step away. He should have turned back, returned to his comrades in Athens, and reported her presence. But something held him there. "I could call the guards," Eirene replied softly, her hand resting gently on the dagger she kept hidden in her robes. "But I won't." There was a beat of silence between them, the air thick with tension and curiosity. Irene's gaze never left his, and Alexios felt something stir deep within him, a feeling that went against all logic. His city was preparing for war, and she was the daughter of a powerful Spartan family. Everything about their existence was dictated by duty and honor, yet here they stood, strangers connected by an unspoken bond. "Why don't you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, the moonlight casting silver shadows across his face. "Because I think you're like me," she answered, stepping closer, her eyes searching his. "You're tired of being told what you must fight for. You're tired of having no choice." And just like that, the walls that had been built between their people for centuries began to crumble. Over the next several nights, Alexios and Eirene met in secret on the cliffs, their stolen moments filled with quiet conversation, shared dreams, and a passion neither of them had anticipated. Beneath a blanket of stars, with the vast Aegean Sea below them, they found solace in one another. They were more than just enemies caught in the crossfire of politics, and they were human, drawn together by a force neither could control. But the peace they found on those cliffs was fragile. Both knew that their love was a dangerous one. If anyone discovered their meetings, it would spell ruin not only for them, but for their families as well. Irene's father had already betrothed her to a powerful Spartan warrior, and Alexios was bound by loyalty to Athens, where war was no longer just a distant threat, but an inevitability. Their love was forbidden, yes, but it was also unstoppable. Each night they met, the bond between them grew stronger, and each night, the dangers surrounding them crept closer. As the city-states of Athens and Sparta prepared for battle, Alexios and Eirene knew they were running out of time. Soon, they would be forced to make a choice between their love and their duty, between peace and war, between honor and betrayal. The warm winds of the Aegean brought the scent of war to the cliffs. The tension between Athens and Sparta had reached a breaking point, and both city-states were arming themselves for battle. Every day brought new whispers of armies gathering, alliances forming, and betrayals unfolding. But amidst the growing threat, Alexios and Eirene continued to meet in secret, their love defying the storm that loomed on the horizon. Each time they met, the passion between them grew fiercer, as if they were racing against the clock, trying to cling to whatever moments they had left. On the cliffs, beneath the stars, they shared more than kisses. They shared their fears, their dreams, and their hopes for a world where love could exist beyond the chains of duty and the violence of war. But the weight of their forbidden love pressed down on them. Alexios knew that soon he would be called back to Athens to fight, to lead his fellow soldiers against the very city that had given birth to the woman he loved. The thought of raising his sword against Eirene's people made his heart ache, but his loyalty to Athens ran deep. His family expected him to uphold their honor in battle. His city demanded it. "I can't do it," Alexios whispered one night as they stood on the cliffs, the wind whipping through his hair. His hands trembled as he held Eirene close to him, her warmth the only thing anchoring him in a world that had become so uncertain. "I can't fight them. I can't fight you." Eirene rested her forehead against his, her heart heavy with the same fear. "You have to," she said, her voice breaking. "If you don't, they'll kill you. They'll kill us both." The reality of their situation was impossible to ignore. They had been living in a dream, a world where the cliffs and the sea were their only companions. But now the world was coming for them. War was inevitable, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. "They'll never let us be together," Alexios murmured, his voice filled with anguish. "Even if we survived the war, even if we found a way, they'd never let us live in peace." Eirene closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. She had known from the beginning that their love was doomed, that the world would never allow them to be together. But that knowledge didn't make it hurt any less. She couldn't imagine a life without Alexios, without the nights they spent wrapped in each other's arms, whispering secrets beneath the stars. "What if we ran?" Alexios asked suddenly, his eyes blazing with desperation. "What if we left? Right now? We could sail away, leave the city-states behind, live somewhere far away from all of this." Eirene's heart raced at the thought. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine it a life where they were free to love one another, where the war didn't touch them. But the reality of their situation came crashing down on her. "It's not that simple," she whispered, shaking her head. "My father, he's already betrothed me to a Spartan warrior. If I disappear, if I run, they'll come after me. After us. We can't escape them." The weight of her words settled between them, heavy and suffocating. There was no way out. They were trapped, bound by the duties they were born into, by the honor their families demanded of them. But Alexios wasn't ready to give up. He refused to believe that their love was doomed, that there was no way for them to be together. "We can still fight," he said fiercely. "We can still find a way. If I survive this war, if we both survive, I'll find you. I'll come back for you." Eirene's chest tightened with emotion. She wanted to believe him, to believe that their love could overcome the impossible odds stacked against them. But deep down, she knew the truth. Once the war began, everything would change. They would be swept away by the tides of fate, by forces far beyond their control. "I'll wait for you," she whispered, her voice trembling as she placed her hand on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "No matter what happens, I'll wait for you." They kissed then, a desperate, passionate kiss filled with all the love they had for each other, all the fear and uncertainty that clouded their future. The world outside might be falling apart, but in that moment, they were the only two people who existed. But even as they clung to each other, they knew their time was running out. The next day, Alexios received the order he had been dreading. Athens was preparing to march to war. His duty was clear. He had to return to the city and lead his men into battle. There was no escaping it now. That night, as they said their goodbyes on the cliffs, the weight of their separation felt unbearable. "Promise me," Alexios whispered, holding Eirene's face in his hands, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and desperation. "Promise me you'll stay safe. That you'll survive this." Eirene nodded, her heart breaking as she looked into his eyes. "I promise," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. And with one last kiss, Alexios turned and walked away, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this might be the last time he would ever see her. As he disappeared into the night, Eirene stood alone on the cliffs, the sound of the waves crashing below a reminder of the forces beyond their control. War was coming, and with it, the threat that they would never see each other again. The Aegean winds howled as the first fires of war illuminated the distant horizon. Athens and Sparta were finally at each other's throats, and the armies that had been preparing for years now clashed with terrifying force. Blood was shed on the open fields, swords clanged, and the cries of the dying echoed in the valleys between the city-states. The world had erupted into chaos. On the cliffs overlooking the raging sea, Eirene stood alone, her heart heavy with fear. Every night, she had returned to the spot where she and Alexios had shared their most intimate moments, waiting for a sign, for any word of his fate. But as the days turned to weeks and the war only intensified, her hope began to waver. She had kept her promise. She had stayed alive, though barely. Her betrothed, the Spartan warrior her father had chosen for her, had left for the battlefield, giving her some reprieve from the crushing weight of her arranged marriage. But with every passing day, the walls around her seemed to close in. Every glance from her family, every whispered conversation, reminded her of the reality she was trapped in. But even as the war raged on, Eirene refused to let go of Alexios. She remembered his final words, the desperation in his voice, as he promised to come back for her. She clung to that promise with all her might, even as the world seemed determined to tear them apart. Then one night, after what felt like an eternity of waiting, she heard a sound, a rustle in the bushes behind her. Her heart leapt into her throat as she spun around, her eyes scanning the darkness. At first, she thought it was a trick of the wind, but then out of the shadows, he emerged. Alexios. His armor was battered, his face smeared with dirt and blood, but it was him. He had survived. He had come back for her. Alexios. Eirene whispered, tears filling her eyes as she ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck. For a moment, it felt like everything else melted away. The war, the danger, the fear, it was all gone, replaced by the overwhelming relief of having him in her arms again. But as they stood there, clinging to one another, the reality of their situation quickly set in. The war wasn't over. The world outside their love was still falling apart, and they were both caught in its crossfire. "I came back for you," Alexios said, his voice rough from exhaustion. "I swore I would." Eirene pulled back slightly, her hands trembling as she cupped his face. "You're hurt," she whispered, her heart breaking at the sight of him. "You shouldn't be here." "I couldn't stay away," he replied, his eyes burning with the same intensity that had drawn her to him in the first place. "I couldn't leave you behind." But even as he spoke, Eirene could sense the darkness that loomed over them. The war had changed everything, And their love, as powerful as it was, wasn't enough to stop the world from tearing them apart. "They'll come for us," she whispered, her voice trembling. "If we leave together, if we run, they'll find us." Alexios took her hands in his grip firm despite his injuries. "Let them come," he said fiercely. "I'd rather die with you than live without you." The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy cloak. She wanted to believe him, to believe that they could somehow escape the war, the expectations of their families, the inevitable destruction that awaited them. But deep down, she knew the truth. Running wouldn't save them. "I can't ask you to do that," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You have your honor, your duty. If we run, you'll lose everything. And so will I." Alexios shook his head, his eyes filled with desperation. "You're everything that matters to me, Eirene. The war, the city-states, my duty. None of it means anything without you." Tears streamed down Irene's cheeks as she looked into his eyes. She loved him with every part of her soul, but the world they lived in was unforgiving. Their love, as deep and powerful as it was, couldn't change the tides of war. "Then we'll face it together," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her. "No more running. No more hiding." Alexios nodded, his heart aching with both love and sorrow. He knew, just as she did, that they were out of time. The armies of Athens and Sparta were closing in, and there was no escaping the storm that was about to descend on them. As dawn broke over the cliffs, the sound of approaching soldiers filled the air. Eirene and Alexios stood together, hand in hand, their eyes locked on the horizon. There was no fear in their hearts anymore, only love. Whatever fate had in store for them, they would face it together. The first line of soldiers appeared over the ridge, their armor gleaming in the early morning light. Irene's betrothed, the Spartan warrior, led the charge, his eyes burning with rage as he saw her standing with Alexios. "Eirene!" he bellowed, his voice filled with fury. "You dare betray Sparta!" Eirene stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest, but her voice was steady. "I choose love," she said, her voice echoing across the cliffs. "I choose Alexios." The Spartan warrior's face twisted with anger, and he raised his sword, ready to strike. But before he could move, Alexios stepped in front of Eirene, his own sword drawn. And in that moment, time seemed to slow. The world around them blurred as the armies of Athens and Sparta collided, the clash of steel and the cries of battle filling the air. But for Alexios and Eirene, there was only each other. They fought side by side, their love giving them strength in the face of overwhelming odds. The world might be falling apart around them, but together they were unstoppable. But even as they fought, they knew the truth. The war would claim them eventually. There was no escaping it. As the sun reached its peak, casting long shadows across the battlefield, Alexios and Eirene shared one final look, one final kiss. And then together, they faced their fate. Their love, though brief, had been more powerful than any war, any city-state, any honor. It had transcended the boundaries of the world they lived in, and in the end, it had been the only thing that mattered,